The sky over the Bismarck Sea that morning was a hard, bright blue, the kind of light that makes metal glint and makes every movement distinct. On the bridge of his flagship, Rear Admiral Masato Kimura watched the convoy slide through the water. Like a small fleet of islands, destroyer bows cutting spray, transport hulls riding slightly lower from their heavy loads. Men stood at rails, officers peered through binoculars, signal flags snapped in the wind. There was a sense of routine, the methodical discipline of sailors who had executed this chore many times. Keep formation, maintain speed, watch for periscopes, trust the umbrella of anti-aircraft fire. The transport smelled of diesel and sweat. The decks were cluttered with crates, roll-up stretchers, and stacked ammunition cases lashed down tight. The soldiers clustered in shaded corners, some asleep in the lee of superstructures, others swapping cigarettes and whispered jokes to hide their nerves. Below decks, medical supplies and rations were bundled beside rifles and entrenching tools. Letters from home were tucked into helmets. On Kembaru, officers had posted lists of names and berthing assignments. Men checked their equipment and rehearsed what to do if alarms sounded. The convoy's captains had briefed their crews about air threats. Lookouts were posted at every masthead and in every crow's nest. There was confidence in the practiced drills. The convoy had faced air raids before and had learned to move as a single defensive organism. The destroyers prowled the outer ring like guard dogs, guns trained, crews at action stations ready to pour lead into the sky. On the American side, the mood at Eagle Farm and other forward bases near Port Moresby was a mixture of urgency, tired determination, and a hard-won optimism. Mechanics who were more used to fixing engines and replacing propellers now welded armor plates and mounted .50 caliber guns in unusual configurations. Pilots who had spent months learning high-altitude bombing now hunched in B25 cockpits practicing straight, low runs over the water and lining up on hulks of derelict ships. Major Edward Elner and Major Paul Irvin Gunn traded notes on ballistics and timing. Navigators plotted approach vectors, gunners counted belts of ammunition and rehearsed the rhythm of opening fire. There were arguments about weight, balance, and vulnerability, and there were long, cold briefings where every crewman was told his role in the dance to come. When the attack began, it unfurled like a planned crescendo. The high-altitude B-17s and B-25s climbed to draw attention and provoke response. From the Japanese perspective, the sky filled with the familiar signature of medium and heavy bombers, and for a tense moment, every pair of eyes looked up. The destroyer gun crews reacted with practiced speed, rangefinders clicked, predictors adjusted, and the air filled with the staccato of 25mm fire and the heavier cracks of 5-inch guns. Tracer streams stitched the blue, and clouds of gray smoke from burst shells drifted across the sun. It was loud and disciplined, a machine of steel and training. Then the other element arrived, a violent, low, almost invisible thunder as the modified B-25s came in under the radar of most experience. Flying so low that spray from their propellers shimmered on the water, they leveled off and bore down like thrown spears. From the destroyer decks, the sight was uncanny. Aircraft at wave-top height, noses bristling with guns, moving at speeds that left little time to aim or to take evasive action. When Major Lenners Mitchell, ruthless, opened fire, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Muzzle flashes erupted from the nose, a continuous ribbon of light and sound, and armor-piercing incendiary rounds began chewing through thin railings, antenna masts, exposed lifelines, and crewmen. The psychological shock was immediate. Sailors, frozen on deck, described a sensation of being under a continuous hail of metal, each hit driving splinters of wood and metal into faces and chests. Anti-aircraft positions vanished beneath curtains of fire as gun shields and mounts were shredded. The concentrated fire turned ships' decks into places no man could safely remain. Some gunners never had a chance to complete their training. Drills. Others made heroic last-second runs to manual mounts and kept firing until concussion and fire forced them back. Skip bombers followed a heartbeat behind the strafers, timing their release to coincide with the moment ships' decks were being cleared or their attention was fixed on high flyers. Bombs skipped and slammed into hulls, exploded with terrifying proximity, and sent geysers of water and shrapnel over surviving decks. A single well-placed skip bomb could immobilize a ship by breaking its engines or flooding a boiler room. A follow-up strike could finish the job. Chaos spread quickly through the convoy. Smoke rose in columns that turned black as oil-fed fires took hold. Lifeboats burned or were torn away. Ships listing and on fire presented impossible questions for captains already wounded by the initial surprise. Some destroyers tried desperate countermeasures, tight turns to throw off gunners, concentrated fire on low-flying attackers, and attempts to lay smoke screens. But the low-level attacks' speed and intensity left little room for coordinated defense. Communication lines, both radio and signal, were disrupted by fire and confusion. Amid the wreckage, there were moments of conspicuous bravery. Damage control. Parties fought to stem fires with buckets and hand pumps. Sailors dragged wounded shipmates into shelter, and officers shouted calm into radios to organize withdrawal. Life rafts were launched in the open sea, and wounded were transferred with the assistance of destroyer boats that could still move. Survivors described the surreal sight of men clinging to debris as columns of flame consumed their ships, while other vessels tried to close and pick them up under the threat of renewed attack. At command centers ashore, news of the attack traveled like a shock. In Rabaul and other Japanese naval headquarters, initial radio reports were fragmented, and the scale of damage only became clear as fragments of reports reached higher echelons. Officers who had trusted in doctrine and experience faced the cold fact that a new tactic had broken through their defenses. For the Allies, the attack validated experimentation, improvisation, and the grit of air crews and mechanics who had turned theory into deadly practice. It was a demonstration that adaptation, shortening the kill chain between aircraft and ship with concentrated close-range fire and precise low bombing, could change the tactical balance at sea. In the days that followed, survivors counted losses, and the Japanese command recalibrated its assumptions about convoy security. Reinforcements bound for Leh were delayed, reduced, or destroyed. Supply lines became riskier, and the Imperial Navy was forced to reckon with a weapon and a method it had not expected. For the Americans and Australians, the success encouraged more conversions, refinements in coordination between fighter bombers and strafers, and a new emphasis on low-altitude attacks in the South Pacific. The B-25s that had been modified on the fly in field workshops were no longer curiosities. They had become instruments capable of turning organized convoys into scenes of sudden, terrible ruin. The Japanese had seen B-25s before, but never like this. Never with a row of gun ports in the nose and never flying so low that pilots could read faces on a ship's deck. Allner held his fire until he was about 100 to 200 yards away from the destroyer Shiryuki, then opened up. 8 50 caliber guns spat tracer and lead in straight, bright lines toward the ship. The hits were immediate and terrible. Armor-piercing incendiary. Rounds slammed into the bridge and superstructure at high velocity, shattering windows and ripping through thin gun shields that offered almost no protection. Anti-aircraft crews were cut down as their positions were shredded before they could respond. A survivor from Shiryuki's bridge later described it as being run through by a giant metal saw. The captain and most of the bridge team killed within seconds while steel and sparks flew. Liner pressed his attack for 8 seconds, pouring roughly 900 rounds into the destroyer, then let 2 500-pound bombs skip across the water and strike just under the hull. Those bombs, set with short delay fuses, punched through before, exploding and broke the ship's back, flooding engine rooms and leaving Shiryuki listing badly. As he climbed away, his tail gunner raked the deck with more 50s. Sailors abandoned guns to try to stop flooding they could not control. Other Mitchells followed, picking targets across the convoy. Pilots were stunned at how quickly the Japanese ships seemed stunned and helpless. One B-25 pilot walked a long burst of fire down the side of the transport Kakusi Maru, watching tracers cut through the bridge, smash cargo gear forward, and silence anti-aircraft positions. Then his skip bombs struck the hull. The transport's captain could not steer because his bridge crew had been killed. The helm was unmanned and the bridge lay in ruins. Australian fighter bombers added to the destruction. Their 20mm cannons and Lewis guns concentrated on gun crews and command positions to stop any organized reply. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy, diving in at mast height toward Tio Maru later, said he watched the bridge seem to fall apart under explosive rounds, sailors thrown by blasts, and lifeboats splintered into useless wood. Skip bombing and the delayed fuses multiplied the damage. Bombs that bounced across the sea slammed into holes at waterline and exploded inside, tearing open holds and starting fires. One transport, Nojima, took 3 such hits in quick succession. Its plates were torn open and the compartments where soldiers were packed flooded fast. Men wearing full kit had almost no chance to get out, and witnesses later said the cries from below decks could still be heard over the engines and detonations. Commander Yasumi Doi watched in horror as his best-trained gun crews were swept away by the heavy rifle fire from the B-25 noses. He shouted orders to redirect and concentrate fire on the low attackers, but the gunners were being killed faster than he could reorganize them. Survivors were too shaken to man their stations as the Mitchells came in with their noses flashing. The Japanese had no doctrine for this. Medium bombers converted into flying gun platforms, attacking at wave-top height and pairing strafing with skip bombing. When the destroyer Arashio tried to place itself between the attackers and the transports, it only drew concentrated attention. 3 B-25s focused on Arashio. Their combined forward guns swept the ship's superstructure into twisted wreckage, killed the bridge party, wrecked fire control, and jammed her rudder hard to one side. Out of control, Arashio struck Nojima. The 2 ships became locked as fires spread and crews could not separate them or fight the flames. Admiral Kimura, watching from his flagship, found orders and maneuvers useless against planes that came from everywhere and so low their fire was almost point blank. The Americans were not following familiar patterns. They were not mounting torpedo runs or dropping bombs from high altitude that could be dodged. They were coming in close and using automatic weapons to turn ships into killing zones. One transport, Ogoa Maru, suffered when her captain turned to give the attackers a broadside, a fatal mistake. Lieutenant Donald McCullough in Sleepy Time Gal opened fire from about 2,500 yards, his 8 guns punching through the hull at the waterline and igniting stores of ammunition and fuel. Secondary explosions blew out large sections of the ship. Skip bombs finished the job and the transport broke apart. Most of the roughly 2,500 soldiers aboard had almost no chance to escape. The whole attack lasted barely 15 minutes, but it shattered the convoy. Burning, sinking hulks replaced the orderly procession of ships. The destroyer Asagumo, attempting to pick up survivors, was itself hammered. Gunners swept her decks clear and bombs opened holes under her waterline. Men in the water who thought they might be safe were strafed as lifeboats were ripped apart. The American pilots were carrying out orders to stop reinforcements reaching New Guinea by any means. By about 10:15 a.m., as the last B-25 headed south, Admiral Kimura surveyed the wreckage. All 8 transports were sinking or already sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers were lost, including Shiryuki, and the survivors were badly damaged and full of dead and wounded. The sea was littered with bodies, debris, and burning wreckage. Only a handful of the original 6,900 troops would make lay. Fewer than 1,200 were saved. Many only after submarines arrived under cover of night. Most of the 51st Division had been wiped out not in ground battles, but while trying to reach shore aboard ships turned into death traps by modified bombers. Survivors and officers later wrote that the attack felt like nothing they had imagined. The 8 forward-firing 50-caliber guns on each B-25 put more automatic fire onto a single target than most destroyers carried, and those guns could be aimed and brought to bear with the speed of aircraft. Traditional naval defenses and tactics had no ready answer. When Commander-in-Chief Isoroku Yamamoto received the report, he understood the implication at once. Surface ships could no longer move safely inside the range of enemy air power. If convoys could be destroyed like this, resupplying forward garrisons in the Solomons and New Guinea would become nearly impossible, with grave consequences for Japan's hold on those regions. Yamamoto ordered an immediate review of convoy rules and anti-air defenses, but he quietly told his staff that there might be no real way to stop the American gunship B-25s. Turning the B-25 from a standard medium bomber into a low-flying, forward-gunned attack plane was practical wartime invention, born of need rather than peacetime plans. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, nicknamed Pappy, working with limited tools in forward Australian fields, led the early field conversions. Mechanics reinforced noses, added ammunition racks, and mounted multiple 50-caliber guns so the planes could spray ships with heavy rounds while still carrying bombs. Those field fixes were so effective that North American Aviation adopted the idea. Later, B-25J production models were built to accept many forward-firing guns, and factory versions could carry a similar heavy armament without the jury rigging. After the Bismarck Sea raid, these strafing Mitchells spread across the Southwest Pacific and began striking wherever Japanese ships tried to move. Units converted quickly. Several bombardment groups started flying the modified B-25s and hunted coastal traffic around New Guinea, often painting fierce nose art and names on their planes. Other units learned to attack harbors and anchorages by day and by night. Some used radar to find targets in darkness. By late 1943, Japanese commanders reported that any daylight movement of ships larger than small fishing boats in areas within B-25 range was nearly suicidal. The Navy was forced to rely more on submarines and fast, nighttime destroyer runs to keep forward garrisons supplied. Those methods could carry far less than full convoys, so forward units began to run short of food, ammunition, and medicine. The lay garrison that the March 3 convoy was meant to reinforce never received enough supplies and was evacuated months later, with many soldiers dying from hunger and disease during retreat. Japanese attempts to fight back were limited. Fighters found the low, fast attacks hard to intercept, and kamikaze-style ramming attempts were sometimes tried but could not stop the steady losses. By mid-1944, the Japanese merchant fleet had lost a large share of its shipping, much of it to strafing and skip bomb attacks that could turn transports and cargo ships into burning wrecks in minutes. The B-25 strafers did not just hit ships, they also struck airfields. Low-level attacks in August 1943 on Wewak destroyed many aircraft on the ground and left parts of the Japanese Air Force unable to operate for some time. These converted B-25 crews developed a strong identity. They took pride in flying a plane that combined a bomber's range and payload with forward firepower greater than many fighters. They painted bold nose art, named their ships, and celebrated the machine's ability to deny sea lanes to the enemy. For Japanese sailors and soldiers who survived encounters with strafers, the experience left deep psychological scars, recurring nightmares, an instinctive fear when aircraft engines were heard, and a reluctance to move in daylight. Strategically, the strafer forced a rethink. Planners assumed daylight movement would be detected and destroyed, so operations that had been routine the year before became impossible. The Tokyo Express night runs to Guadalcanal were one adaptation, but even these lost ships when B-25s equipped with radar began hunting at night. Senior Japanese officers began to call the B-25 strafers one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific, and some recommended that surface ships avoid operating within range of American air bases whenever possible. That effectively ceded large parts of the ocean to Allied control. Australia played an important part too. RAF units flew Mitchell strafers alongside American squadrons, using local knowledge of the waters to find targets and striking aggressively around the Netherlands' East Indies. Technical upgrades kept coming. Rocket rails, better gun sights, and experiments with larger cannon were tested. And late-war B-25 variants carried many forward-firing 50-caliber guns in addition to other armament, turning them into flying arsenals capable of attacking from several angles. Other nations noticed and tried to copy the idea. German and Italian observers were surprised by the concept of converting a medium bomber into a gunship. Some Axis designs experimented with forward cannons, and Italian crews used skip bombing-like tactics. But few could match the combination of heavy forward firepower and coordinated low-level bombing that the Allied B-25 strafers used. The strafer's influence went beyond World War II. The idea of mounting heavy forward-firing guns on transport or support aircraft reappeared in later designs, such as gunships used in Vietnam. After the war, analysts and historians in Japan and elsewhere called the strafer one of the key tactical innovations of the Pacific Campaign, arguing that it undermined Japan's ability to protect sea lines of supply and forced strategic concessions that sped up Japan's collapse. Stories of dramatic raids, like the attacks on port anchorages that churned harbors into burning oil and wreckage in minutes, became part of the lore passed down in bomber units, proof that adaptation and ingenuity could change the face of naval warfare. Mechanics got faster and better at the conversions as they learned the B-25's structure. By late 1943, field shops could change a standard B-25 into a strafer in under a week, fitting the 8 nose guns, extra ammo racks, and stronger mountings with practiced speed. They improved the ammo feed so the guns wouldn't jam during violent maneuvers, tuned the weapons so the fire concentrated at the best distance, and altered the controls so a pilot could fire only a few guns or all 8 at once. Skip bombing tactics improved too. Crews found that approaching at a slight angle made it harder for ship gunners to track them while still letting bombs hit accurately. They learned that releasing a bomb around 60 feet above the water and roughly 340 yards from a ship made the bomb skip correctly and strike the hull. Fuse delays were set to fit the target, shorter delays for thin-skinned transports, longer delays for tougher warships. Japan tried a variety of counters, bolting extra-light anti-aircraft guns to decks, turning suddenly, stopping, or reversing, but none stopped the flood of fire from multiple 50-caliber guns. Adding radar-directed AA helped a little in places, but by then Allied air power usually arrived in numbers large enough to overwhelm those defenses. Keeping the strafers flying in rough tropical conditions was a constant struggle. The nose guns needed careful maintenance to resist rust in the heat and humidity. Crews cleaned and adjusted ammo feeds after every sortie, and engines and airframes wore out faster from low-level attacks. Ground crews worked long nights to have planes ready at dawn because a mechanical failure during a low pass often meant death for the air crew. Intelligence was a big part of the strafer's success. Coast watchers, submarines, and code breaking gave B-25 squadrons timely targets, sometimes only hours before a mission, so the planes could catch ships when they were most vulnerable. The B-25's range and firepower let crews strike opportunistically near forward airfields, so few Japanese ships felt safe anywhere within reach of Allied bases. Those missions were expensive in human terms. Low-level attacks against defended targets produced heavy losses. The 3rd Attack Group alone lost over 40 B-25s during the war, most shot down while making strafing runs. The stress of flying straight and level into flak and guns, holding steady under fire, and pulling up at the last second left many veteran crews medically or psychologically unable to continue combat duty. The strafer's success changed American thinking about tactics. It showed that field modifications and practical experimentation, giving skilled people like Major Paul Irvin Gunn the freedom and tools to try new ideas, could produce weapons more useful than some purpose-built designs. Commanders who backed those experiments helped speed the change in how the Allies attacked shipping. For Japanese survivors, the attacks felt cold and mechanical. Many described the 8-gun nose as a flying machine gun nest. You could point at it and it would simply spray destruction. That impersonal, relentless fire left deep psychological scars among sailors and soldiers who lived through it. As the war moved on, crews adapted the strafer for new roles. By 1945, they were attacking small suicide boats, coastal defenses, and industrial targets. The heavy forward fire proved effective against trains, radar sites, and ground emplacements. Plans existed for massive strafing sweeps against Japanese harbors before an invasion, though the surrender made those unnecessary. The strafer also had a technical legacy. Later aircraft and concepts, gunships, and heavily armed attack planes trace a line back to the improvised B-25 conversions. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, for instance, is a later example of an aircraft built around heavy, close-range firepower to destroy ground targets. The practical details of the strafer became well known among aviators. Each 50 caliber gun weighed about 64 pounds and could fire roughly 850 rounds per minute. 8 guns plus mountings added several hundred pounds to the nose and required careful balancing. A typical load of about 400 rounds per gun meant roughly 3,200 rounds total, enough for a short, devastating burst, but not for continuous fire. Pilots typically fired for only a few seconds at a time to conserve ammo and avoid overtaxing the aircraft. By the war's end, the strafer crews were among the most decorated in the Army Air Forces. Their missions helped isolate and starve Japanese garrisons by making daytime sea movement deadly. The last combat strafing missions flew as Japan surrendered on August 14, 1945. Even then, these aircraft were used to stop small ships trying to escape. Ultimately, the B25 strafer stands out as a landmark example of wartime improvisation, a standard medium bomber turned into a ship killer by pragmatic mechanics and daring crews. From field workshops in Australia to later production changes, the strafer program shows how quick adaptation under pressure can reshape military practice and, in this case, help change the course of a campaign.